have a great speaker today, and she told me she's never ever given this talk or any version of it before, so which is a joke. So Beth DeCarolis from UNMC Sponsored Programs is here today to talk to us about some of the new and ever-changing things at the NIH. So it's like death and taxes, right? New things from the NIH. So Beth is going to talk to us about some of the newer changes. If folks who are on can mute lines, et cetera, that would be fantastic. We're getting a little bit of feedback. For folks on this end, if you can sign in for the talk, that would be great. Hopefully have time for questions at the end of this, because I know people always have questions, particularly people as they're thinking about their next grant, which is probably due next week on Beth's timeline. For a little background, Beth has been part of sponsor programs here for 10 plus years, and recently became assistant director of sponsored programs at UNMC 2 or 3 years ago now, and so has played a really important leadership role. And for anyone who's dealt with Beth, she always deals with tight timelines with total grace, and so as an we always appreciate that. So Beth, thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming to see this presentation, which is my favorite presentation to do today. Oops. All right, so in sponsored programs world, we like to put things in buckets. So is it this or is it this? And often when we're reviewing applications, we're saying, is this a technical issue that might prevent us from getting the grant even into the sponsor's portal? Or is this a policy issue and we want to be sure that how we describe our project is compliant with the sponsor rules? So today I'll be talking about changes that went into effect January 25th, and it's kind of in both buckets. So we have new forms that have to be filled out, and the biggest change to these forms has to do with NIH rules and regulations surrounding clinical trials. So if we just start with these new forms packages, the Forms E, so not to be confused with just e-forms or electronic forms, the NIH has been issuing new forms packages as rules change or as technology changes, and so we're in the 5th iteration, we're in Forms E. And if you submitted any grants in the fall to the NIH, then you might have been disappointed to find out that when your grant got to the Commons, it triggered a warning. So all applications going in were getting a warning saying, okay, you were using Forms D. Are you sure? Yes, we're sure. And so now applications going in, again, are saying, all right, you're on Form Z. Is that the form that you want? And yes, these forms went into effect for applications with due dates of January 25th. So it could have been you tried to submit early, or maybe you were on continuous submission and you were submitting later, but it really is just when was the grant due. So going forward, we should only be using these new forms that we'll be talking about, Forms E. For UNMC investigators, we don't use grants.gov workspace. We don't use the NIH Assist. We have a system-to-system vendor solution called Cayuse, and I get a lot of positive feedback about Cayuse. And one of the features is, let's say you started your application in the wrong package. You don't have to start from scratch. Cayuse can transform it into the correct package. Now, going from Forms D to Forms E means that there's a new form that's included. And so although you don't have to start from scratch, there are some new fields that have to be completed, new attachments that have to be uploaded, which we'll talk about today. So magic, you can transform it into an E package. So to avoid having to transform it, it's important to make sure that you're picking the right application package. So all NIH, or most NIH parent announcements have been reissued, and now there are 2 versions of each activity code, depending on if your project includes a clinical trial or does not include a clinical trial. And this is part of a push from NIH just to make sure that all institutes are handling clinical trials consistently. And I can share a little bit of a horror story, and that was an NIH-funded clinical trial. About a year into it, the grants management specialist asked, why didn't we have a data safety monitoring board? We didn't realize one was required for the type of study. Yes, it was required, and we needed to pay the members $1,000 for their participation. And so I think that was an example of an institute that maybe didn't do a lot of clinical trials, didn't get us maybe the complete information at the start, and then we ended up kind of having to do some cleanup, after we were already a year into the grant. And in that case, we actually got a rare no-cost extension in the middle of the project period, so we could get these requirements in place. So I think it's good the NIH is trying to standardize across institutes. Again, they'll have parent announcements specifically if your project has a clinical trial or not. And so if a clinical trial, there are specific scored and unscored review criteria named in the parent announcement. Some of them have not been reissued as of today that I could tell, and then some just aren't going to have a clinical trial option. So like an RO3, a small exploratory grant, that would not be enough money for a clinical trial. A conference grant, an education grant. For fellowships, institutional training grants, career development awards, it's not that the PI can't be learning about clinical trials. It's just in most cases they're not going to be independently running a clinical trial as part of their training grant. And then also, although NIH is standardizing across institutes, different institutes might have certain types of projects that they're going to be inclined to fund. So we will, based on the institute that you tell us and the NIH that you think would be a good fit for your project, we're going to just take a look and make sure, one, does that institute participate in that announcement? And then two, do we have any institute-specific information about the kinds of clinical trials that they would accept? All right, so the definition of a clinical trial. It's important to point out that the NIH's definition actually has not changed with the January 25th date. It's just their interpretation and implementation of the definition has changed. I always get scared if there's a definition that then requires even more definitions to understand. So if we go to the next slide, this is how they've parsed out the definition. So a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned, and they define that, to one or more interventions to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So again, that's not a new definition, but their interpretation has changed, and now certain projects that maybe we would have said last year, definitely not a clinical trial, are being pulled under that definition. So how is the NIH interpreting the definition then? These 4 questions have become very important to us in the Sponsored Programs Office as we try to help investigators understand, is it a clinical trial or not? We've also recommended that investigators talk to their program officers at the NIH. We've gotten some feedback that the people they speak to might have an opinion, but they still don't have a really good official position on how the NIH would say yes or no. And we submitted last week, on Monday was our first deadline for the NIH R01s. We submitted about 30 grants, and we haven't heard yet that any of them have been kicked out for not being responsive to the funding opportunity. But I think, as of today, it's probably a little too soon to know, did we do it poorly or or did we do it okay? So 4 questions, and all questions would have to be answered yes to determine, yes, it is a clinical trial. Does the study involve human participants? Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants? And is the effect being evaluated a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? And we have some case studies. Before we get to those, again, just to clarify, even if your participants are all healthy, it might still fall under the clinical trial definition. I think the big change for us was the behavioral interventions, things that would not have been seen as a clinical trial previously. Doesn't matter if it's just behavioral, if they meet those 4 criteria. If any of the answers is no, it doesn't count. But if all of them are yes, then it is most likely a clinical trial. But what might fall out of that definition, if this is just to refine measurements and secondary research, so there's existing biological specimens or data that you did not collect. So when we go to the case studies, these were recently updated by the NIH based on some feedback, I'll say negative feedback that they were getting from investigators. So if anyone has read them recently, bonus points if you can guess, would this be considered a clinical trial or not? So the study involves recruitment of healthy adolescent volunteers followed over time to assess brain development and factors that influence brain development. Participants are administered a battery of standard measures at each visit, including blood draws, surveys, various cognitive performance measures, and brain scans to assess the association of these measures over time. Do people say clinical trial or not clinical trial? All right, so yes, there are participants, but they're saying no, that it's not an intervention, so not a clinical trial. So yes, good point. So this is really just to say if it's a clinical trial. However, it still could be human subjects, and that form, the new form, it still needs to be completed, just not all the sections. All right, so study involving patients with acute occipital stroke who are suspected of suffering visual field loss. They are randomized to a drug or matching placebo. Investigator seeks to determine whether the drug affects post-stroke changes in cortical visual representation as measured by fMRI. Clinical trial, not clinical trial. All right, yes. Yes to all questions. All right, recruitment of patients prior to brain surgery. fMRI is performed. Half of the volunteers will be randomly assigned to perform a language listening task, and half will be assigned to perform a language generation task. Brain function maps will be used by surgeons to identify language areas for surgical planning. Investigators will compare post-operative language functions in the 2 groups. Clinical. All right, you guys are good. Last one. Prior to a study of the effects of interference on working memory and brain function, an investigator wishes to test the study procedures and adjust the difficulty of the memory tasks for a range of individuals. To do so, the investigator runs a few healthy volunteers through the procedures and adjusts and finalizes the procedures prior to initiating the formal study. Clinical trial or not? All right, so yes, there are human participants. There are assigned to interventions, but the purpose of the study is not to understand the effect of the intervention. The purpose is to kind of tweak the study design, so not a clinical trial. All right, so regardless of whether you determine clinical trial or not, the Forms E includes a new form that needs to be completed with information on just human subjects research in general. And starts with the information that you would enter on the other project info page of whether or not human subjects are involved. And if you're familiar with the previous version of the form, you may be familiar with exemptions 1 through 6. The form now has exemptions 7 and 8, but the NIH tells us they're not using those yet. So don't click 7 or 8 yet. And you may have a project that has been determined, maybe in consultation with the IRB, as not actually meeting the definition of human subjects. So regardless if it's exempt or not from the federal regulations, it might not be human subjects. So you get de-identified data from somebody who did a study that you were not involved in. So even in that case, you would have to provide a justification uploaded of why your project is not human subjects research. So we're not saying is it exempt, we're just saying your project isn't. You're making the determination, not human subjects. You have to explain to the NIH how you came to that determination. And I would say the IRB would be a good resource if you need help thinking through a scenario or getting some language. All right, so assuming that it is human subjects, might not be clinical trial, you would add a study record for each study in your grant application. And then each study would have up to 5 sections, which we'll go through. So section 1, basic information, and it would carry through the exemption information. And then it has those 4 questions that the NIH likes and we like to try to understand, is it a clinical trial? So from there, once you've made the determination, hopefully you've pulled down the right package. If not, we can quickly scramble and transform it. So it doesn't matter clinical trial or not, it just matters human subjects as far as how much information you're putting into the form. Or stated another way, you have to fill out the form, it's just some of the sections aren't applicable if it's not a clinical trial. So if it is clinical trial, sections 2 through 5 have to be completed. Not a clinical trial, then you still have to describe the human subjects in sections 2 through 3. So section 2, study population characteristics. Probably familiar with, if you're familiar with the old forms, you see the inclusion of women, minorities, and children attachment. You can see that there's now new data fields to include that's a little more granular, so actually putting in ages, minimum, maximum age. And the inclusion enrollment reports from the old Forms D have been moved to this section, and so that would be either your planned enrollment, or if you've actually, you have cumulative data that you're reporting. Next section, monitoring plans. Again, that for just anything with human subjects, you'd be filling this out. And this would be where you would upload your protection of human subjects narrative that you might be familiar with from the Forms D packages. Also going into effect at this time, NIH requirement for the use of a single IRB for multi-site trials that are using the same protocol. So the NIH has said that they want a single IRB responsible for reviewing the protection of human subjects. It could be, let's say UNMC is the recipient and we're subcontracting out to other universities as sites. It could be our IRB is going to act as the single IRB. It could be one of our subrecipients. We could go to a commercial IRB such as Chesapeake, or there could just be an IRB established specifically for our multi-site study. It just has to be registered with Office of Human Research Protection and has to have a membership that's adequate to serve as the IRB for this study. There are some exceptions. If you have foreign sites, they would not have to utilize the single IRB. Again, career development or training awards, most likely the PI or the trainee is not going to be independently leading a clinical trial. So the policy would not apply in those scenarios. And then there are some exceptions. So if you have a site that by law just cannot participate in a single IRB, that's not the case for the university. A time-limited exception, so if you have an ancillary study to an existing study that started before the single IRB requirement kicked in, then you have an exception. There might be some other reason that you want to request an exception. I have not heard of any exceptions being requested that were successful, just in the information that NIH has available online, but we can always ask. And if after you've gotten your grant up and running, you're adding a site that can't participate, then that would be another exception to the single IRB. For the January 25th applications, I don't think I remember seeing one that listed UNMC as a single IRB. I'm looking to Matt in my office to see if he's familiar with one. Right now, we're on the lookout, and we would just get that information to the IRB if we're reviewing an application that names UNMC as a single IRB, to make sure they're aware and they're working with business and finance to come up with a rate structure. The NIH says, yes, it is allowable to charge costs specifically to serving as a single IRB. All right, data safety monitoring plan. I know there's a lot on this slide, so I won't read it, but here are just some bullets that the NIH says they would like addressed in a data safety monitoring plan. And to me, just the takeaway is commensurate with the trial's risk, size, and complexity. So the NIH even says it might be acceptable in some cases for the PI to be responsible for the monitoring, so if it's a low-risk trial. But the risk could take us all the way up to having an independent data and safety monitoring board. All right, Section 4, protocol synopsis. So here's where we move into the clinical trial specific information. So human subjects, yes, but not a clinical trial. You wouldn't have to enter this information on the form. So a lot of it's going to be specific and to your study. Dissemination plan, NIH just gives some pointers. They want to know how are we complying with rules related to submitting the study to clinicaltrials.gov. And IRB has updated their policies to be compliant with the NIH language. So yes, we do have a policy. We've gotten some questions from grants management specialists to make sure that, yes, we do have a policy that we submit clinical trials to clinicaltrials.gov. All right, and then Section 5, other clinical trial related attachments. In the screenshot, it's just that number 5 at the very bottom of this screenshot. So any other attachments. By the time you get to this part of the form, I'm thinking there isn't a lot left you have to say on your study. They've kind of asked about your study in every way possible. The NIH also clarifies this isn't the place just to put anything else that you want to include in your application for them to review. They really want to limit it to information that's going to be critical for the reviewer to understand your project. And it could be that, so you found the right FOA specific to your clinical trial, and maybe the FOA has said, and you need to upload this attachment to the other clinical trials section. So yes, definitely include those. But otherwise, the NIH wants to limit the amount of information that a reviewer has to review. So I have a link to a notice that just describes how the appendix policy has evolved over time. And right now, I would say we very rarely see appendices. I think there was a time when you might attach 5 publications, and it's just not how we get that information to the NIH anymore. All right, so some fun facts about the February 5th R01 deadline. So this is the first big NIH deadline post the January rules going into effect. So submitted about 34 applications. 20 were submitted on the day of the deadline. And for UNMC investigators, you may be aware that we have a 3-day rule. So thank you to the people who submitted ahead of time. And most of the applications, 26 of them determined that they were not doing a clinical trial. There was one for the parent R01 announcement that said it was a clinical trial, and then there were some open special PARs where clinical trials were an option. So they had not, these funding opportunity announcements hadn't been reissued with the 2 options. So I said we're just waiting to hear back and make sure that we did it right. We haven't heard of any of them being administratively withdrawn as of this point, but we're looking to hear, get feedback for our applications or through our professional organizations, just hear if, did we miss the mark or did we understand the NIH's rules? All right, what questions do you have for me? Yes.
I hope this is working. So my question has to do with training grants and or RO3s were mentioned. Mm-hmm. It seems to me those could have clinical trials embedded in them, specifically given the broadening of that definition. It's not unusual for a K award to propose a very simple, clinical, what would be deemed a clinical trial based on this broader definition. So is it that those don't typically contain clinical trials, or is it that they are not? I mean, is there a rule against having a clinical trial in a K award now or RO3 grant?
If we talk about the RO3s to start with, I think the idea would be that there just wouldn't be enough money for the PI to independently conduct a clinical trial, but it could be that somehow they are participating.
I guess I'd push back on that a little bit. I mean, you could totally do a clinical trial that meets that definition, absolutely, for 1 year of funding. I mean, it doesn't sometimes take that much. So I guess I don't follow, is that a black and white rule? Is that something you need to talk to your program officer about? Because it doesn't seem to me that a clinical trial has anything to do with power or how well financed a study is. I'm kind of hearing that. That's why I'm confused a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely would say talk to the program officer, and then I am just looking to see new policies or new FAQs coming out where maybe they look at the RO3s going in on the 16th, and it turns out they had projects that would meet the definition. So I think it's going to evolve.
So just a follow-up, if you did an RO3 tomorrow, it doesn't sound like there's even forms available necessarily to address some of this. Is that right?
The form, the forms package is the same because you could have an RO3 with human subjects. What I don't know is if then you filled out sections 4 and 5, if when it got to the comments, if somehow the package would explode at that point. So I would say early submission in case we need to correct it. And then moving to the career development awards, I think there probably are some that would say the type of career development that we're looking for is a clinical trial, but the parent announcements that are out there now are saying, again, you could be mentored by somebody who is running a clinical trial and you're learning about clinical trials, but at this phase of your career development, you are not independently conducting the clinical trial. Other questions?
Another institution wants to be the primary on the And is the university okay with that?
Yes. Yep. I think as a policy, we're okay with anything that's proposed as long as it makes sense to the study. It would be formally laid out in a reliance agreement, and so if the other university is going to serve as a single IRB, then they would send us this reliance agreement language, and NIH does have some templates. So again, I think we're kind of paving a way, and we're ready to do it. I just don't think we have a lot of examples under our belts yet. Other questions?
Kind of a build on to my last question. If you were proposing a study that is really feasibility oriented, like a K person might, if the objective is feasibility and not necessarily the outcome, I'm guessing that could circumvent this clinical trial definition. That was kind of what you had proposed with one of the case scenarios. So
Right. Yes, and I do think so. Where the fine line might be, and again, I just don't think we have enough examples, is if it would be seen as kind of phase 0 clinical trial, but if it really is getting some of that baseline data to really put together an application for a clinical trial, I think that would be okay. So yeah, I think the question about what is the purpose? What are we trying to ascertain through the study at this point? Are we measuring the interventions, or is it helping us to try to refine the study?
So Heather, can other sites speak up? So I just want to make sure. So we do have other folks from some of our partnering sites on the phone, and I don't know if there's been any questions typed in. It doesn't look like it, but if there are other questions from outside of UNMC, we'd be happy to. Beth would be more than happy to try to take those. We gave enough awkward pause. I think the answer is no. So before people leave today, there is a sign up. A couple people came in late. Please sign in to give us full credit for your being here. I do want to make a plug. Next month, the second Monday at noon, we have Cyrus D'Souza, who's one of the professors in endocrinology here. We'll be talking about recruitment and retainment for clinical trials, and I think some of the novel stuff that they've been able to do in that regard. So folks who struggle with enrollment, which is essentially every clinical translator who breathes, it might be a good talk to listen to. So just want to thank everyone for coming today, and thank Beth again for taking time to talk to us.
Thanks.